hear the music because I didn't turn it on. But you can watch it in silence. Just pretend you're like in the 20s.
This is color.
What's that?
So this is in color.
It's in color. It is in color. I told my wife last night, as we were, I guess I should let it finish. There you go, thanks. Get the tail end of some Persian music. So one of the hardest parts about a book like Esther is there's a lot of really cool stuff in here. I mean, a lot. And it's easy to drown real fast. And so sometimes one of the hardest parts, and really this is every pastor has this struggle to some level, and that is trying to figure out the balance between going deep enough and yet keeping it moving enough so that everybody doesn't get bored. Give you one more night to bore you, and I'll pick up the pace. So as you're making your way to the book of Esther, we are going to get into the text tonight, but I found some of you got copies of this last week. I have a few of those left. If you want one of those overviews, just let me know, and I'll get that to you. I wanted to give you this is going to be important once we get into chapter 4. I want you to get some visual things of what's going on in this area at this time. So this is in Persepolis, which was one of the major towns that Xerxes was responsible for. And you see these big Lamassu characters. They would have wings, human, animal attributes, oftentimes a lion. You can see the wings just barely on the relief part right there. There's a little clearer view. Again, there's the part that would be important. Now, this is, like I said, Persepolis. That's a hard word. Which is the main capital of the Persian Empire. But remember, Esther takes place in what city? Susa, Shushan, either one of the same things. That is a little farther over, and it's the Winter Palace. So that's the Winter Palace. It's where he spent his winters when all the snow was flying. All right. We talked a little bit about the necropolis a little bit last week, and I did it real quick. But this is a wider view of the necropolis. So you've got these three different grave sites. They're all emblazoned pretty drastically, and it is believed that this one here in the center of those is where Xerxes or Ahasuerus or others are buried. That's a little bit of a close-up of what you just saw, where you're looking in now to my point is we have a lot of archaeological evidence from this time period. It's kind of amazing, but things were just so incredibly well taken care of. Now you say, what on earth is that? It's not a corn cob for some of you who are feeling hungry. It's actually a document. Okay, it's a cylinder. And if you look super, super, super close, you'll see letters going down the riff of this thing. So the Cyrus cylinders are one of the things people use as far as corroboration of the biblical narratives. It is a pretty sensational archaeological study. Cyrus is known, Cyrus first, was known as far as allowing the Jews to come back and rebuild. And so it's a pretty amazing kind of document if you think about the amount of writing they're putting on one little tube of paper. So here we have...
Could that have been like almost like a print roller type?
People have argued that, but we have a lot of cylinders out there. So there's a lot of cylindrical things. It could have been, but we really don't have any evidence of any printed things. And of course we wouldn't, because papyrus doesn't last that long. And so if it wasn't carved in stone, it's not going to last. It's just not going to make it that long. Yeah, no, it makes sense. We have multiple cylinders of various documents, not just biblical documents, but extra biblical documents. So Darius the First, and then Xerxes the First behind him. This again is in Persepolis. I want you to get an idea of the scale of this. I'm going to play this video. It's like less than 2 minutes. But this is at Persepolis. And the reason I want you to pay attention to this is you've got to understand the opulence, the grandeur. And, you know, I can show you some archaeological things, and you're hard to picture. There's people walking around in this video. So you'll be able to see the sheer size of these archaeological remains. Come on. No, you're supposed to play. All right, I'll go hit play. If it cooperates. It played just a little bit ago, so it should play. It's not playing. Well, I'm not going to waste time. Maybe I'll show it to you later. I just don't have time to waste trying to get it. I don't know why it's not working. What? Yeah, there's a person. That gives you a little bit of scale. But again, these are still standing. These are available if you go over in this area today. They're still there. Again, this is limestone. A lot of the animal effects and things within that nature. This is still Persepolis. We're about to transition. A little different view. So Xerxes the First, which is who we've been talking about, this again helps just a little bit. It's hard to see in here, but if you look, you can see that the garments were highly embroidered. It wasn't just a pair of pants, so to speak. They were very ornate. You can see the trim coming down the sides and things. So it's, again, probably would have been this particular British Museum is the curator of this, and probably was in Darius's palace in Susa. And so we get into that. Remember last week I talked about the size of the armies. So here is a relief, and they've done it for you in English, but if you look across here, and if you look real close, you can see all these are different soldiers' costumes based on the names of the nations that Darius overthrew, Xerxes overthrew, Cyrus overthrew. So as they gathered them in. So specifically, remember we said some people think his army was as big as 1 million. And so it's really hard. Some of them look really, really very similar. They would have. I mean, Gucci wasn't around yet to show them that they weren't wearing the right color or the right style. They're going to have some basic similarities. Everybody's wearing a skirt for the most part. And so various hairstyles and things like that as well. This is a pretty interesting, relief. Here's what it looks like way up close. It's written in 3 languages, and in those 3 languages, it talks about how great Ahasuerus was. It's make sure everybody knew how much he had. It's just basically a little autobiography, and he put it up there on the side of the mountain so it could be noted by everybody. 3 different languages was pretty good back then as far as writing and forms and things of that nature. So that's kind of cool. Now, I do not know them. I do not. We're moving more into the Susan Palace, and you'll see there's not as much remains left in Susa itself as far as the overall palace layout. So you've got pieces here, and it goes way back into the foreground, and it does extend off the picture this way as well. So we got a lot going on there. Again, very ornate, very beautiful. These would have been at the time very brightly colored. They've just lost that over time. But if you look, you can see some hints of greens and golds and bluish greens here. But again, just amazing, amazing things. This is where we start seeing a little bit. So this came out of the Achaemenid Empire, a gold vessel, again, noting the animal stuff, motifs along the way. This one came from Darius's palace, and it was just a goblet, just something to drink out of. You know what you have on your counter every night for supper. It is made of gold, and again, pointing out the animal motifs yet again. Now, we've gone back to this picture a few times. I talked about it a few times last time, and that is we base Ahasuerus' appearances on the reliefs. All the reliefs show him with curly hair. They show him with more of a rectangular type beard. They show the taller crowns in some of the reliefs. Now, as far as the colors and after that, probably we're stretching just a little bit. But they're doing their best to try to help us to understand what we were looking at. We looked at this the last time, but I thought it was too confusing. So what I did is I sped it out a little bit and made it worse. Okay, so here you have Media Capitana. Over here is Persepolis. Here is Susa here, Babylon. Tim, we were talking about that last week. See, they are in close proximity, but they're not directly on top of each other. Jerusalem is over here. Now remember, they could have gone back after the captivity. They could have returned to Jerusalem. But speaking in terms of percentages, a very small percentage actually returned to Jerusalem. And, oops, I hit the wrong button on here. Every once in a while we do that. Would have returned to there. Here's an overlay that gives you a little bit of an idea of where we're talking about. This is Iraq, Iran. There is Syria, Jordan, Israel. There's Lebanon, Cyprus, modern day Turkey is up here. You say, what's that really have to do with anything? Let me show you another map to make it. This is a little bit more spread out. Again, key places for us as we look at. There's one of the palaces here. There's the other palace there. And you see, he came down even into Egypt. Remember, we said one of his titles could have been a pharaoh. He could have held the title of pharaoh because of his excursions there. And here's an overlay one more time. So you see, this broadens it out to show you how big this empire is. So Afghanistan's over here, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Turkestan, Tajikistan, a little bit of Kyrgyzstan, even bordering into China a little bit on the very edge, all the way over to Sardis, into Greece. Now, he had a failed attempt to capture the Greeks. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well. So, I mean, I got to understand, this is a huge amount of real estate that was encountered over a very specific battle after battle. Now, this...
I'm seeing that highway, it's going over a lot of mountains.
Yep, this is the Royal Highway. One of the things that Alexander the Great was known for was his roads. And so Alexander the Great's not on the scene here, but there are some people who believe that this specific Royal Highway was the groundwork for Alexander the Great's thinking about having highways that would cross an entire empire or little empires as they took over. But yes, it does go right through the mountains. It does. It's an absolutely incredible thing. And part of what you've got to be considering, there is a vast mountain range that runs right in here. You can't really, it's a lot of mountainous stuff, but there's a big one right here, and the armies had to go through that to conquer all these individual lands. So we're not talking just, me and Ma and the two kids on the back of the donkey going for a couple days trip here. We're talking major battle armaments and things of that nature. And so stick with me. I know some of you are like, can we get in the book yet? Yes, we will, I promise. So roughly 560, Cyrus, these aren't in order. These aren't in order. Uh-oh. Maybe it is. So Daniel actually goes back this way. These are books. The blue ones are Bible books. The ones we want you to see is Cyrus the Great, okay, who had came along. He is the one that actually ends up conquering Babylon. The next ruler in line, Cambyses is here, very short-lived, considered illegitimate. And then Darius the First becomes king, and you see how Haggai and Zechariah kind of rope into that area. Then you get to, we talked about how many temples were there. So you have the first temple, you have the second temple, and what's considered to be the third temple is considered to be Ezekiel's temple, which is the millennial temple. But there are also arguments to be made for Zerubbabel's temple and even Nehemiah. Some of the other builders along the way, like Nehemiah, could have had some claims because they continued to add on to and move out from. There is our guy that we're looking at. Darius is defeated at Marathon. That's not the big battle, though. So then we get from there and we move on just a little bit. So we're picking back up. So Darius is defeated, right? There's our guy right there. I think I circled him again. Then in the middle of this, here's where we come into Esther becoming queen. All these dates are approximate. We don't have a lot. Some of us were talking last week about all the Xerxes and Artaxerxes and the whoever is next. Well, there's one of them right there. This puts in perspective where Malachi would have came in. Xerxes the second. You got Xerxes the second, quickly followed by Darius the second, followed by Artaxerxes the second. So you got all these Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and that's why all this Xerxes stuff becomes so important. We got to figure out who goes where. It's very important. And then, again, here's picking up where Artaxerxes is king. Artaxerxes III takes over. Artaxerxes IV, followed by Darius III, followed by Alexander the Great, which that was the end of that, Jack. That was the end of the empire. So you've got all these different Xerxes and Dariuses, and for us, sometimes you have a junior, and every once in a while you'll have a third, but you don't run into a lot of those even. My family, my mom's side of the family, there's Jonathan Fitzgerald Hall IV, but he cut that line off to the chagrin of his grandmother. Along the way. These are the important ones that we want to talk about. So Cyrus II, which would have been Darius the Mede. So here we got to put these in. We got a little bit of the Chronicles, information in Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and even Isaiah on this, mentioning this. Cambyses II is just in there to let you know that somebody was in there for a short amount of time because otherwise the dates don't match up. Darius the Great comes along. Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah. Daniel 9 mentions this, mentions the Medo-Persian Empire taking over. That's why I put out there. And then followed by Xerxes the First.
Cyrus is, who was the one who said that the Israelites could go and were going to build their temple and all this?
Oh, back. You're back. Yeah. Cyrus II is where the big remodeling project and the outer layers started to build back up. Part of that was because as few people as returned to Israel in that initial return, they trickled in afterwards. So as more Israeli people, nationals, moved back to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, they were able to continue building out the area as well. So that's the last slide you're going to see tonight. I felt like I was in college. Yeah, me too. See, what happens is three of you ask me a question, and then I spend all week looking at all these charts and graphs and looked at Bob. Some of you are in Bob's Sunday school class, and I went through his thing. He brought that over to me, and I'm going through all this. Oh, man. Sure. The one at Susa or the one... If you remember when you were up here, when we were looking at, we said that it extends on off to the left. That were the living quarters were out that way, and that's where the harems would have been. The place that this banquet is going to take place, that we're going to read here in just a second, Everybody thinks it's at the kitchen table like we have in our house. Well, most of the time, even in our homes, you don't have bedrooms unless you got company right next to the dining room. Somebody's pallets laying in the living room because they've been sleeping on the floor while they're visiting you. But usually the bedrooms are in one location, the kitchen, but we're talking a lot more area to cover. And they could literally push out their living quarters so that number one, they weren't in danger of somebody coming in and killing them while they were asleep. Number two, it did allow for some version of privacy, although I'm not so sure what you would call privacy with the amount of servants and attendants and eunuchs and all of those things. So this is an amazing culture. When the Iraqi war happened, if you remember, we started seeing a lot of artifacts that had been looted, and they kept coming up and kept coming up and kept coming up. Well, a lot of that stuff came out of the Babylonian Empire, which is who the Assyrian Empire takes over for. And guess what they did first? They had all those belongings. And so you'll see a lot of crossover. You'll see lions' heads, rams' heads woven into Assyrian things, even though that wasn't necessarily an Assyrian distinctive. Part of what's difficult when we start looking at cultures across Scripture is that we assume everybody has the same culture. We've just gotten used to that until you talk to somebody from West Virginia. And all of a sudden, they're saying things that they don't mean anymore. Something like, bless your heart. That's not a compliment, y'all. If somebody from down south says, bless your heart, it is not a compliment. It's a negative thing. It's more like, you dirty rat, you. There's my best impersonation. But there was an amalgamation of cultures down through. If you go back to Egypt and you think about Moses leading the nation of Israel out and all of the trappings that would have came out of Egypt, those images, those statues, those reliefs were a part of the mindset. And so every time it moved on, sometimes it was kind of an incorporation. So instead of it just being a lion, now it might be a lion with wings, or a lion with horns, or a lion with a human face. It grew as the cultures grew down through. Now, I mentioned Zoroastrianism last week, and the reason that just came back to my mind, it is considered to be outside of what we would call monotheistic theology, which was initiated by God. Eventually will become Judaism, but we got to go back further than that. It wasn't Judaism in the garden, just in case you were wondering. I don't know what you want to call it other than just a theocracy, because that's what it was. But Zoroastrianism was one of the first kind of monotheistic religions after the Garden of Eden. So it was a very different belief system with all of the gods and stuff. The Larussos that we saw with the guys with the beards and the wings and the animal bodies, those were taken off of images from a previous god figure that was a protector of the city. Thus, the reason they're at gates. But again, that wasn't really part of their theology at this point, but it had become part of their culture. And there are certain things, there are certain words that you say that everybody looks at you and goes, huh? You're like, well, that's what my mom's called it. What do you call that thing that you put your noodles in to dry them off? All right, what was it? Colander, strainer, hairnet. What was that? That's gross. So depending on where you're at, what I'm trying to get you, in order to understand what's about to unfold, you've got to think about things. Is it a jacket? Is it a sweater? Is it dungarees or is it jeans? Some of you are old enough to remember what dungarees are. What? Is it a rubber band or is it a gum band? Do you wash, or somewhere in between? Mangoes? Oh, yeah. What do you, is a mango a fruit or a vegetable? Around here. Around here, it's a fruit. See, what I call a green pepper is a mango. Yep. I hear you. Let's dive into the text. Now, it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. Now, I attempted to slaughter the actual name that he would have gone by in the culture. I'm not going to do that for you this week. So you just you hang on to that. We're going to go with either Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Xerxes is actually his Greek name. So it's the Greek translation of Persian and Hebrew. This took place in the, now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who ruled from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being present. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. That is one whale of a party that goes on for 6 months. So this banquet is a 6-month banquet. Nothing on 600-pound life. There's got to be something coming out of there worse than that after eating for 6 months. Well, we'll talk a little bit about it. If I were to say the operative word in the entire first chapter of the book of Esther, it would be excess. Excess, because we're going to see that round its way out. We begin to suspect it even from the very first verse. It's not just that there was this Ahasuerus, but it's the Ahasuerus that reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. I mean, we're talking bragging rights here. And this is one of the reasons last week it gets a little muddled as to who the author of the book of Esther is. The Jews, by the way, think it was Mordecai. We know that whoever it was definitely had access to the higher courts of Persia. We also know the Hebrew is very complex for the book. So this is an educated person as well. It was most likely, not Esther. That's just, it could have been. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't, but it was most likely not her. So we run into this new name, this Ahasuerus. There's kind of two basic meanings of the word. One is I will be silent, which he didn't seem to live by at all. If anything, he was very loud, not just with his mouth, but with what is going on. Chapter 1 is actually a foreshadowing of all kinds of actions and reactions that are going to figure very prominently into the main plot. A scene in which the king is kind of so easily persuaded to issue some ridiculous edict, published, post haste, prepares us for the main plot. Then we see the king casually giving approval for some kind of unreasonable edict against the Jews, and then the revving up of this communication network to get it publicized. And you sense all of this foreshadowing running on, and it's best encapsulated in a midrashic identification of who Ahasuerus. What's the midrash again? Anybody remember? I haven't talked about it for a while. Yeah, it's not canon, but it's pretty close. Yeah, it would be our equivalent of a commentary, but it's held a little bit on higher equivalents. And all it is a list of arguments, literally. This one said that one said this one said that one said this, and just depending on who you agreed with. But this is what we read, and this is a specific midrashic reference to Rabbi 1.1 and the Targum Shini. And it says, Ahasuerus, who put his wife Vashti to death on account of his friend Memucan, who is identified with Haman, is the same Ahasuerus who put his friend Haman to death on account of his wife Esther. And you see already, you see this commentary and you're going, huh? Is all that right? So you begin to see that. The language of this chapter is very heavy with duplication, kind of interruptions and kind of turning back on itself. And it's kind of to again, I think it's a linguistic skill that adds to the layers. It makes it like a thick tapestry. It's a really cool feature. Couple of things that we talked about last week that I want to reiterate because it's going to be important for us to continue to remember. No book has more to teach us on prayer, and yet no prayer is ever written or recorded. We learn so much about true intercession through Esther's life. We learn we really see a kind of a foreshadowing of what Christ would do on our behalf before the Father. And it's just amazing. We talked about last week, God's name is never mentioned. Remember I said last week that Esther has an apocryphal addition to it. In that apocryphal addition, there's like almost 80 references to God all of a sudden. So it's like somebody came along and said, well, God was there, why didn't somebody say it? So they added to the book and added to the story. It's very different from the rest of the book. That's one of the reasons we know that it most likely should not have been included in the canon. There's historical errors in it as well. But from our perspective, this invisible God's fingerprints are everywhere throughout this story. Martin Luther had a problem with the fact is he tried to get it removed from the Bible altogether because he thought no religious content, nothing shouldn't be in there. So you have some things like that. There are all kinds of manuscripts of tons of portions, and I'm not going to bore you with all of the places they are, but if we just talked about all the scrolls and rolls and things and evidences that reiterate this book. Esther's name, which we've not even seen yet, is going to become very important. It is most likely a reference to Ishtar, which means morning star or star. Either one of those, or daughter of a star, all of those. It's actually Akkadian, very closely related to the god of the planet Venus. Her Hebrew name means myrtle. Who else went by that title? What? Someone. I'll save that for another day because I didn't jot it in here. My notes cut off. Sorry. We just came through the Feast of Purim last week. It was going on. And so as we get into this, we have these inscriptions and all of these listings of what life was like. Magnificence, extravagance, lavishness. There are, throughout the palace, specifically the one at Persepolis, has like all these different times where, and he did this, and he did that, and he took this, and he overruled this, and he killed this many, and he did this many. It's like this constant. And some people would say, well, is that arrogance? Well, I don't know. They didn't have the internet or newspaper to post what happened, so this is the best way to get history, I guess. But it, from our perspective, does seem a little bit of arrogance. There is a mention of the inscription, and it begins this: I am Xerxes, the great king, the only king, the king of all countries, all kinds of languages, the king of this entire big, far-reaching earth, the son of King Darius, the Archemenian, the Persian, a son of the Persian, an Aryan of Aryan descent. Okay, that's a mouthful. Hi, I'm Tim. you get this. Herodotus will confirm the expanse of the empire going from India all the way into Ethiopia. somebody asked me afterwards or emailed me, I can't remember which, how long did the events? We talked about it fitting between chapters in Ezra, but how long is the book? Approximately 10 to 11 years is about the amount of time the book of Esther covers in total. Some people will span it out to 12, and I'm okay saying that. 10 to 12 years sounds a good ballpark. When we get into Ezra and Nehemiah, it talks about how the exiles were faring in Jerusalem. Esther kind of answers what happened to the people who stayed behind. So if you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah, you're hearing how things are rebuilding and how things are going over in that Jerusalem, Judah area, that green area. We put that map up there for a brief time. That's what they're focusing on. This is what's happening elsewhere around the world, around their globe at that time. Could very easily be that would be the rest of the story, so to speak, kind of mindset. It is the theme. There's another theme that runs throughout this book, and it's reversals, and it's probably most illustrated by the careers of Haman and Mordecai, which will unfold in the weeks and months and days ahead. So we read these verses, and they begin to set what we'd call the glory of, a nickname of this kingdom was called the Silver Kingdom. We'll talk about why in just a minute. Probably because it kind of followed behind the head of gold. My prophetic students are all awake now. There is pretty much worldwide dominion at this point. It is absolutely amazing what Nebuchadnezzar saw as a statue, an image that he thought was all about him initially, had indicators that would literally span all of time, some of which is yet to be fulfilled. And so there's this big prophetic statue that gets built. Well, we were moving from the head of that statue down into the breast of that, the Silver Empire. That is the Assyrian Empire. That's what this time period, and again, it will carry it down apart as we continue to unfold it. There is a beautiful scene it introduces in this. It's somewhat typical for writings to start off with this phrase, "Now it took the place." For lack of a better phrase, "once upon a time," except for it's not a fairy tale. It's a historic thing. Starting off with the king's name would have been very important because timelines were attributed to rulers. So dates were attached to rulers more than they were a calendar. As we dig into this, there is not a complete dependence on God for anything in this chapter, as far as we can see it. People have argued, as we get into this, that Mordecai was a very pious man. I think that's probably a good word, pious, but maybe not really living it out to its fullest. But yet, enough that when something was going awry, he was ready to step up when it was necessary. So when we look at this, we have this big, huge feast. Again, Shushan, Susa Palace. People, small and great, and it's going to last a long, long time. Like we said, 6 months. There is a quick, I'm trying to skip a bunch of stuff. In Daniel chapter 6, there's a mention of 120 satraps, and people have tried to say that discredits the book of Esther because Esther mentions 127, but the key word is in satraps and provinces. So satraps could be divided down into provinces, and so you could have more than coming out of that. It's really coming from two different periods of Persian rule. Daniel's referring to an incident that happens early in the Persian Empire during the reign of Darius, and now we're kind of quite a ways in by the time we run into Ahasuerus. And to have to start with 120 and be up to 127 is no big deal whatsoever. I mean, dividing things down would have been absolutely incredible. India here, Pakistan, kind of modern Pakistan would be a good idea as far as what kind of in that area. We saw that on the map. Again, you've got Egypt. Yeah. Part of what we know is India, yeah. So he has, there are a number of palaces that he has scattered out. This is the Winter Palace, is what we talked about. When Xerxes took over, he kind of swiped out all of the gods, the Egyptian gods, the Babylonian god figures. They were all changed in some ways, and that's some of the artwork that we find. Darius I rebuilds this area during that battle, and that's where we end up coming up with the palace, that Winter Palace, before he bent Persepolis at all. So think of Susa in its location on the map and think capital of the world, as well as you know it, in that culture. And so if you put your finger on Susa, and you look out and around, it's pretty close to the geographic center of that map. So it might have been Ahasuerus' Winter Palace, but it was the center of a lot of things. We have tons of again, archaeological evidences. One of the coolest happened in 1850. There was a French archaeologist that began to unveil what you got to see a picture of. And it wasn't until 1850 that they began to dig out the palace at Susa so we could see the footprint. And that led to tons of things. The occupation of that region probably goes back to, I don't know, somewhere around 4000 BC. There would have been people living in that region. So it's not like all of a sudden there's people in this area because of this story or because of what this happened. So you look at this and you say that he sat down on his royal throne, which is at the citadel. Well, what's a citadel? Easier word, acropolis would be another word, or a fortified area. It is an area that's raised up. The Hebrew word that's used here is it's a fortified area above the rest of the city. It's kind of almost like able to see around everywhere. Being that this banquet, this party is being had in this area, in this region, you need to think about this citadel because it is the ruling place as well, and that's going to become important in just a couple chapters. How important this area is. Excavations show that the main city had approximately 6 or 7 miles, 72 feet above the general level of the fortress is where this citadel was. So, 75, 70, somewhere between 75, maybe even up to 100 feet. There was a rectangular platform that went around it that was 2.5 miles. The palace is underneath all of that, and the inner city is amazing, but the citadel fortress is something that you look up to see, and you see the lights flickering when the parties are going on, and you see the late night cherub celebrations in the throne room. All of these events are going to migrate from the citadel down into the palace, back up into the citadel. They're going to migrate back and forth, and we got to pay close attention. It is important when you see here that doesn't say that Ahasuerus sat on his throne. They emphasize this word, royal. You say, what does that matter? This book is very vivid and very descriptive. And you've got to be thinking, some of us, how many of you guys have been out to Lancaster to see Esther? So a good number of us have been out there. Remember when the first time we got to see Persia and the lights came up and this, I mean, it was that and so much more. That and so much more. Beauty beyond compare. And so when you add all of these adjectives into it, it helps us to understand. Now we see that in the 3rd year, verse 3, the 3rd year of his reign, it's given over to entertainment. Now, I guess this would be a great place to say that it's probably not that they ate and drank night and day for 6 months. It was probably in connection with planning the attack on Greece. It was part of this planning phase. So, you know, you'd go out during the daytime and draw pictures and move little army men around. And then it comes supper time and y'all have a big banquet again. There would be big celebrations, lots of dancing, entertainment. Interestingly enough, the word that is used for banquet here is very, very closely tied to drunkenness. So that gives you any indication what's going on here. You know, they played by day and drank by night, a kind of story that is going on. So the 3rd year, somewhere around 483 BC, there were 2 purposes with this. Planning, I think, was part of it, but also part of it was a reassurance to all of these rulers and leaders that you see, these officers, these nobles, these princes of all these outflying. It's kind of a like, hey, you got nothing to worry about. You're up here. You look at all I've got. We've got this covered. And the other thing is, doggy bags were famous during this time period. Literally, when there would be major banquets, families could go home with anywhere from like what we would call like a quarter of a cow to a whole cow worth of meat to take back to their province from the provincial leader. Now, whether he shared it when he got home was a whole other story, but the idea of you came in, you partied, you planned, you were reassured, but you were also sent back out with food too. It's this kind of big thing. See, I've got you. You don't have to question what I'm doing. I've got everything under control. You just listen to what I say, do what I tell you to do, and we'll all be happy. That accompanied with the amount of conquest that he has done. So somebody asked the question, approximately how many people would be at a banquet like this? Rough estimates are somewhere between 15 and 20,000. Yeah, just a little small party. Drina's cooking. Sure.
Do you think this 180 days of display his wealth and power, and especially when he mentions military leaders and nobles and princes from all the provinces, do you think this was a means of consolidating and unifying the empire?
Very much.
Because it seems that way.
Very much the idea here is it's kind of a two-sided coin when I talk about, you know, this idea of reassuring, but it's also, this would be when anybody who wasn't falling in line would be standing out real obvious in one of these type of occurrences. And anybody who was out of line would have been brought back into line or replaced very mysteriously amongst all the other guests. Somebody would show up. He's not at dinner tomorrow night. Oops, what happened? So yes, it very much was consolidation. It probably was a little bit of saber rattling as well, as far as, you know, trying to get the word out all across outside of what the current empire is, which is a massive amount of people. But, you know, you've got 6 months' time. That's enough time to get the information over towards Greece. That's enough time to get the information over towards Greek. Hey, man, they're up there. They had, you know, just in their rulers, they had 15,000 people. And they've got an army. So it could have been a little bit of saber rattling as well, as far as going on there. There was a royal, I guess the best word would be chamberlain. His duty in the Persian palace, and we see this from extra biblical literature, there was one guy who had this job. It was always assigned to somebody who was very trusted. Take the drunk king and put him to bed. That was his job during banquets like this. It was after the king was as inebriated as he possibly could be, and they would drink into a stupor. And so somebody's got to make sure the king doesn't get killed. Somebody's got to make sure he gets to bed. And this was a way to protect him but it was also kind of a trusted position in this. When we look at the administration, we're talking about freemen, not slaves. We're not talking about slaves at this point. They've all been designated specific privileges. They're given grants of land. So all that big map, somebody has said, okay, this part is yours. This part is yours. You know, kind of like drawing the states around here. This is Texas, that's Kentucky, you know. And there were these boundaries that all of these provinces oversaw. They really took care of the day-to-day means of everything that's going on in this empire. It's an interesting term that gets used here, and it closely connects to a passage in the book of Ruth chapter 2, in verse 1. It's very similar to that Proverbs 31 as well. The idea of a man of substance. That idea of a man of substance, a good man, a providing man. That's these nobles, that's these princes, that's these people. Yes, there was probably military leaders, but it was also the governors who were in charge of all of them. All of these lists of leaders fits the known fact that the empire had a pretty amazing administrative system from everything we can tell. Again, look how many countries this place covered, and everything stayed pretty well intact. After the final expansion of the Assyrian Empire, it didn't dwindle off until the end of the Xerxes' reigns, when Alexander the Great would come in. So we've got this banquet. You're thinking feasts. You're thinking alcohol. You're thinking not just alcohol. The word that's attached to it is drunkard, as far as the Hebrew goes. Most of these banquets would have been held in the evenings after a day of work. So that helps us also understand that there was probably something more going on than just a 180-day party. I mean, how could you stand up for 180 days of partying anyway? I mean, you got to wear out eventually. Unless they were teenagers, and then they never die. There would have been, just to give you some ideas here, let me get my text here, make sure I get the right word. Thinking in terms of what were they eating? Fish, breads, olives, vegetables, cheeses, honeys, dates, figs, beef or lamb would have made it at this time period as well. Yeah. There's an interesting debate about that. There's an interesting debate that happened, that these provincial leaders went, they weren't actually in the banquet every day for 180 days that they visited. There's another argument is that each one of those province leaders would have had a close governor, a military man. So you got the president and the Secret Service. So the Secret Service was going back and forth, giving them the reports to the palace. But it could be possible that they left as well. It's really hard for us to understand, because I don't know the last time y'all were at a 3-day party. I mean, it's been a long time since I've been at anything more than a couple hours, And so we don't understand, when we read these stories, we don't understand what it was like. But again, distance played an issue. Traveling. You didn't just pull up. It took time to get there. So once you were there, you tried to do as much as you could while you were there.
Well, I was just going to point out that even to the hundreds of that here in this country, because of travel, someone went more than 2 states away, you stay for maybe an entire summer or something as a guest in someone's house. So given that travel is probably a little better then in that time than back then over that 80.
True. And there's I mean, the fun thing about this is when you read this text and we put with extra biblical literature to help us understand the culture, there's a lot of room for possibilities within those things because we don't have a lot of it. The other thing to think about is who put the bill for this? Yeah, Xerxes put the bill for this. So it was a very costly affair. So they didn't do something like this without an intentional purpose, which is one of the reasons I personally think that it was also a planning period for the battle where he was going to invade Greece. Now, his father faced a big defeat at Maranathan, or what you now call Marathon, but same area of near Athens. But Xerxes' immense fleet would defeat the Greeks at Thermopylae, but then the Battle of Salamis in 480, that was the end of that going over there anymore. You go back and stay in your areas and leave us people alone. Well, we know how that went. So when you read through this and you see all of these riches, the rich, verse 4, he displayed riches of his glorious splendor in his great majesty for 180 days. Remember I told you that a key word throughout this book is banquets. This is one. This is number one. It went 180 days. Now, not going to talk about this too much, but I want you to see what happens right after this. Verse 5. When the days were completed, what days? The 180 days. Then he has a banquet that lasts for 7 more days. Excuse me, Your Highness, how about having another party to follow this one up? If I go to a party and I have a party on Friday night and Saturday night, I better not be doing anything on Sunday but sleeping. Well, I'll be preaching first. After a day or two, I'd be pretty tired. But after this period, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. We've changed locations. We're moving to a different banquet. We're reading a new description. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen on silver rings, marble columns, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement, papyri marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. This is where, it was pretty on the outside, but as we're moving in, it's getting even prettier. To quote my grandmother, it was always prettier. Not prettier, but prettier. And then we read in verse 7, drinks were served in golden vessels of several kinds. I showed you one of those kinds on the map. That would have been one kind of vessel. They didn't all look like that. There were some various things. Royal wine was plentiful. Even after 6 months, royal wine was plentiful. Think about the storehouses for that. Just the storage units for these kinds of things. According to the king's bounty. So I'm going to pause. No, I'm going to read verse 8. The king the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, so nobody was forced. For so the king had given orders to each of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. So there wasn't it was the king says, we're not forcing this on anybody. Now, I see two sides of this coin, but we'll get into this a little bit more. Hey, we just went through 180 days of wine. There's no sense pushing this off on anybody. If they ask for it, give it to them. If they don't, it's okay. That's my brain going, what's going on here? But it is another feast. So you've got banquet 1, 180 days. Banquet 2, 7 days. And banquet 2 is when an entire nation falls apart. All because of a woman. I said it out loud. I'm going to get crucified now. No emails, no text messages. But you're going to say it wasn't the woman's fault. If he hadn't have done this, we'll get there next week. Thanks for sticking with me as we dug in. From here on out, there won't be as much historical background, not as much calendars or not as much maps and things. We'll be picking up the pace slightly as we continue to move on. We kind of read through the details tonight. We'll get into the drunkenness that happens, and then there's the demand that happens, and then we'll keep it unfolding. So what I would encourage you to continue doing is just kind of read through the book of Esther, even once a week. Even if it's every other week, I'm okay with that. But hey, if I read through it once every 3 weeks, I'd still be okay with Amanda.
Now, the second piece there for 7 days, was that after the nobleman had left and gone home? Was this then, the first argument was just for the general, all the people, but is this strictly for the townspeople for having,
There's definitely
southern peace for so long and kind of, hats off to them or something?
There's definitely a downsizing. We don't have a whole lot of information textually, because textually is it still describes a pretty broad group of people.
Which is those in the palace,
Yeah, this was not new people coming in. It would have been people who were already there. Most likely, we're starting to move into the inner circle at this point. And because as we get into Vashti's refusal, you'll see that it's kind of those rulers that rise up and say, you going to let that woman get by with that stuff? And it's kind of that inner circle that comes out of that. So this is definitely, and again, literary technique's amazing. So we've got 180 days. We've got 15,000 people. We've got 7 days. We've got however many that are left, still several thousand. And it all boils down to one woman. That narrowing of the focus. It will happen again as we go through the book. Goes back out. We start talking about the Jews in the land. It narrows down. It's going to be Esther. And it goes back out. There's this in and out feeling. It's gorgeous literature. If you look, there is, even if you don't understand it, if you go online, you can hear the book of Esther read in Hebrew, and it's kind of cool. So if you find a way to do that, there's a couple different. I can do it through my program, so I don't know exactly what app to tell you to go to. But as we think about these things, let's ask some questions as we close. Was it wrong that the king had all of these things? Was that a problem? Why not? I mean, come on. You know how he got all that stuff?
Well, if it were ill-gotten gain.
Are spoils of war ill-gotten, or are they spoils of war? Was it? When you read a description, when you look at these archaeological things, I hope you begin to understand that our idea that of things that happened way over there and are out of our memory are huge pieces of biblical understanding. Rachel's boyfriend is in Greece right now on a missions trip this week during spring break, and he's posting all these pictures of Athens and all this stuff, and I'm going, stop posting pictures. You're making me covet. I want to go on this trip. But it's, and I mean, some of you guys have been to Israel. It changes everything once you are standing by some of these massive palaces and statues, and understanding that this was a culture that was not, it wasn't backwoodsy. It wasn't just a bunch of hillbillies. I mean, we're talking an incredibly literate, very, very wealthy culture. There was definitely a caste system. There was definitely the very rich and the very poor going on. But anything that you could have put your heart to, they found uses for everything, for herbs and spices. And I mean, they were, medicines was developed so much further by this point than even what the Egyptians had done. Oh, yeah.
And you may have troops coming in from other outside countries who want to say, oh, you know, don't invade us. You may have, and think of the taxes or what was being taken
Yep.
Right, rather than having a bunch of other smaller ones paying, this is all going into one. That would be a massive amount of money.
Yeah. You brought up Solomon. It's interesting. There's a story that Ahasuerus ordered a throne to be built like that of Solomon. And they came back to him and told him it was impossible. It couldn't be done. And so he said, can we build one like it? And so something of that description was still carrying through, with all of Solomon's vast wealth. And I don't know whether they just didn't have enough gold or they didn't have enough infrastructure or enough information. I don't know what the problem was, but I thought that was interesting when I was reading some of the Assyrian stuff that was one of his orders, to build me a throne like that of Solomon. Probably because he thought he was just as good as Solomon. He had the same problem that Solomon had. How about that? Now, we'll talk about that more next week. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for stretching us. Help us to lean into these. Sometimes, God, we have to confess when we read these narratives that we know this is your word. We know it's the word of God and the words of men. We know that you have undertook this through the breathing of the Holy Spirit, that we have such rich theological content. But sometimes when we read something that is more narrative or poetic, like we get into the book of Esther, our brains are tempted to somehow drift into almost fiction. Help us to understand that you have not only inspired, but you have also protected and preserved your word. And we believe that the book of Esther is here by your direction, by your choice. And if it's there by you, your choice, it then is for us that we would learn and we would be different as a result of reading this story. Who knows what our country, our world that we live in, our little small worlds that we have, will ask of us at times, of our kids and our grandkids. We don't know what is yet to happen. But one thing that we can rest assured of, that even when your signature cannot be seen, your fingerprints are all over the place. And help us to find hope and trust in that. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Oh, somebody asked me, I don't remember who you were, what's a good Esther commentary? Jeremiah's is pretty good. If you read David Jeremiah's on Esther, it's pretty good.